If there's one thing fascinating about Dragon Ball Super, and I pause when I say fascinating about Dragon Ball Super because a lot of you probably just cringed when I put the word fascinating and Dragon Ball Super in the same sentence, but it is the mere fact that Dragon Ball Super introduces new concepts and just overscales characters in certain ways that when you go back and you think of the original series and how the original writing was supposed to go, you start thinking, well, wait a minute, well, if this is true here, then why didn't this happen there? And in today's video, we will essentially talk about how laziness and overconfidence got the future androids killed. Android 17, specifically, is a character in Dragon Ball Super that got abnormally powerful compared to where he was before. Android 17, as we can see in this diagram here, was stated to be stronger than 18, but he was obviously weaker than 16, so he's kind of like the middle child of the 16, 17, 18 trio. And based off of performances against other characters, it was always given an impression that he was stronger than 18, but the gap between him and her wasn't that significant because they were built on a similar model. And as a result of this, Android 17 made a massive power-up in Dragon Ball Super where he's able to fight against Goku as a Super Saiyan Blue. Now, you can go into how much Goku was really going all out, but that's another conversation for another day. The point is that Android 17 got a lot stronger because he trained over these years. You'd get to a point where you'd say, well, if Android 17 can get to the power of a Super Saiyan Blue in Dragon Ball Super by training by himself, then in the future timeline, the whole reason why the androids were killed in the first place was simply because they were too lazy to train because they didn't think they needed to, and they were just basically playing GTA in real life, literally, because they're so strong, they're basically on God mode, and they don't have to worry about any threat on the planet killing them. So as a result, they slacked off all those years and just basically killed humans for entertainment. Imagine he trains with his sister, Android 18, who, based off of performances, doesn't seem to be that much farther behind him. How strong would they have been many years later? Well, now this brings up an even bigger question about all of this. If the future androids were able to get stronger, would our heroes would have ever had a chance to even fight them in the first place? Well, let's break this down specifically and start talking about certain characters. The first is going to be future Vegeta. Now, we obviously didn't get a lot about future Vegeta, but we did see a brief scene of him in a flashback episode called Ghosts from Tomorrow, where he was fighting against Android 17. 17 was clearly holding back, and Vegeta gets easily defeated. Now, if we always scale 18 to being less than what 17 is, then that would mean that based off of how easily 17 killed Vegeta, then she could also do the same thing too, especially considering the fact that Android 18 beat Vegeta, who was stronger in the main timeline, directly one-on-one. So, obviously, 18 could obviously defeat future Vegeta as well, the character of future Gohan. Now, based off of how future Gohan scales them is always a complex debate, because when you look at how future Gohan performed against the androids in the anime adaptation, it was heavily implied that he was at least individually as strong as one of them, if not a bit stronger. And this is obviously based off of the battles that we saw in the anime adaptation, where in the amusement park, Gohan actually gains the upper hand on 17 briefly before 18 jumps in, and she overpowers future Gohan, and then the androids start beating up on Gohan together, and then Trunks jumps in, and that's basically how it works. Now, 17 made a statement in the manga adaptation that he had used less than half of his power the last time that he had fought against Gohan, and the whole time in the future timeline, 17 never really needed to really go all out against Gohan, and he also never needed 18. So that's two major important power scaling points, which ultimately means that the gap between future Gohan and just 17 was so massive that future Gohan never stood a chance all these years, whereas if you look at the anime adaptation, there are moments where you would see future Gohan overpowering the androids with a beam clash by himself, and the androids were fighting together, and there were also moments throughout the battle where Gohan would at least temporarily get certain edges against each android, even with them fighting him at the same time, which clearly shows that if it was an individual battle, Gohan probably would have been able to beat them in a one-on-one fight individually, and considering the fact that the androids said in the anime adaptation that they were going to go all out and kill Gohan this time, they wouldn't go all out if they didn't need it to, especially because 18 jumped in and helped. So with all of this said, future Gohan is kind of in a weird scaling where he's probably slightly stronger than one of the androids individually in the anime adaptation. Now where does this lead us with future Trunks? This is always interesting because we have to bring up a theoretical Zenkai boost. Now obviously Bulma made a statement that Trunks wasn't that different from what Gohan was before Trunks engaged them. But then if we count a theoretical Zenkai boost that Trunks would have gotten after being beaten near death by the androids that was taking place off screen, that would have put him over future Gohan permanently. So the future Trunks that goes back to the past to kill Frieza is stronger than the future Trunks that fought against the androids and was sent to the hospital. We just have to quickly point those two things out. Theoretically, if you continue with the whole Zenkai boost, even though they're not mentioned, but theoretically he would have been. Now, with that said, Trunks makes another statement saying that when Vegeta was fighting against 18, that the androids in the present timeline were stronger and that he was able to somewhat hold his own against the future versions of the androids. Now we can take this with a grain of salt because you could also say that in the manga adaptation specifically, the androids were just completely holding back against Trunks the entire time. So because of that, the manga adaptation would clearly hint that the androids were just going easy on Trunks, so Trunks thinking the androids were stronger in the present timeline. It's just that the androids had to actually put more effort into the fights as opposed to the future timeline. And if you actually look at the anime adaptation too specifically, this doesn't even fully make sense because Trunks got beaten up worse by the androids than future Gohan did. Like, future Gohan actually, like, held his own, and the androids were just completely toying with Trunks. So we can say clearly that future Trunks fighting the androids to try and avenge Gohan in the anime adaptation would have been weaker than future Gohan before he died, based off of anime performance differences. Now going back to Dragon Ball Super, just imagine what the future androids would be if they were training throughout the entire future timeline. From the advent of all of the heroes coming out and trying to fight against them and all of them getting killed, and throughout all of these years, they actually trained the entire time. Our heroes would have never have stood a chance against them, specifically for one major reason. The androids have infinite energy, so they can train as much as they want, which means that if they can get stronger, then their gains would be infinitely increasing at a rate that we couldn't even imagine. And the honest truth as to why the androids never trained in the future timeline, and the answer is obviously that the story originally wrote them in a way where they weren't supposed to get stronger and they were supposed to kind of stay the same, so that when Trunks comes back, he can kill them very easily. But then when you start factoring in, well, what if the androids got stronger over the years too? Well, then Trunks would have never have stood a chance, because think about what Trunks had to do to surpass him. He got multiple Zenkai boosts, and then on top of this he trained for 3 years, and then on top of this he goes to another timeline and trains even more, and then comes back, going into the Room of Spirit and Time and learning all the things that he learned in the present timeline, and ultimately defeats them. Think about what Trunks had to do to kill them. Now just imagine if the androids were training the entire time and increasing at a significantly faster rate than Trunks or Gohan were, because the two training partners were significantly closer. And if there's one thing that we've learned about Dragon Ball, it is the fact that when you have a training partner that is around as strong as you, that can really push you into becoming stronger, it increases your gain significantly more. And because the androids are somewhat relative to each other, 18 would gain a lot from 17, and 17 would gain a lot from 18. And because the pairing group of future Trunks and Gohan would be a lot lower, neither of them would have ever have stood a chance, and we couldn't even imagine what level of strength they would have been far into the future. Now let's not go crazy and say blue level, but theoretically you'd think if 17 could train by himself, why can't 18 and 17 get to that level in the future timeline? Well, the obvious answer is because the writing wasn't written in a way for characters at that time to be blue level, but you could just imagine the kind of gains that they would have had, and that also would have meant that when Cell eventually showed up, they would have destroyed him so easily it wouldn't have been funny. And this would obviously conflict with Dr. Gero's plan of having Cell to absorb them and get stronger himself, because if Cell's supposed to absorb him to get stronger, but he stands no chance against either of them individually, then there's absolutely nothing he can do about it. So as a result of all of this, the androids would have completely demolished everybody had they trained over the course of all of those years, and the future timeline would have been completely busted. With the only hope of killing the androids being that Trunks went to the past and acquired a shutdown device to literally just deactivate them from existence, because without that shutdown device, it would have literally been impossible to kill any of them if the androids trained consistently with each other and got gains anywhere near what 17 was getting in the main timeline that we see. And remember, guys, 17 got that amount of training by himself. Now, there are people who theorize that he trained with the Cell Juniors on his island, and for those of you who don't know, there's a side chapter that I talked about in a separate video that, like, explains that the Cell Juniors actually survived and they were on, 17's island, and they were fighting against Gohan and Trunks, and you could look that up on your own, but other than that, there really is no way that we could imagine 17 getting that strong.